Hi everyone. In this lesson we are going to sketch out some ideas to make a 3D printable version or two of this guy. So let's take a look at this picture of Squirtle and try to break him down into shapes that we can make in Tinkercad. Now, as flat shapes go, there are some parts that are pretty easy. His head is clearly a circle, as is his entire body. We can use cylinders to make a flat object or spheres to make a more three-dimensional one. While his arms might look a little bit complicated, if we make some ovals, we can see we can have these oval shapes sticking out to create his arms, and the same for his fingers. While they do look a little bit pointy, we could use triangles, but I think a rounder shape will just make him nicer and less likely to poke you if you use him as a keychain or something. The shapes that will be difficult to do are this swirl in his tail, which is going to take a little bit of creativity, and the interesting shape of his mouth. So we can see that his mouth shape has a little down, up. So we're going to have to add some things together to make a hole that will create this mouth shape. So take a look at a picture of your own and see if you can figure out what shapes that you want to use for all of our objects. And we're going to take our design ideas for Squirtle and turn them into a truly three-dimensional version of him standing up. It looks a bit complicated, but you can see that just like our flat one was made with mostly cylinders, he's going to be made mostly of spheres. So let's go ahead and move this guy off to the side and start fresh. We're going to drag out a sphere and increase the number of steps so it looks a little smoother. We'll change it to a more appropriate blue color, and then we're going to stretch it out a little bit using our center, the black box handles here, so that we can stretch it in one direction at a time. And we want to make it maybe a little taller, maybe a little wider, and maybe a little bit. There we go. His face is a little flatter. Once you like that shape, we're going to design this face. So we're going to need a hole, same as our flat design. That's going to cut out this mouth shape. So, looks like what I wanted to have done is set this head up so that the top of it is its face. Since I'm going to have to be rotating it into position later, I can go ahead and flatten this out a little bit in this direction. Let's zoom in here. And we're going to use our top view to make our face. That looks good. So let's create some eyes by using a hole to cut the bottom edge off of a sphere so that he's got that eye shape with the flat line on the bottom. So I'm going to duplicate the sphere that I already have, close in size for my head, and we're going to squash it into shape so that it's going to look like an eyeball. And let's change this thing's color so we know what it's supposed to be. Then we're going to drag in a box that is already set up as a hole. And you can use any shape to turn into either a solid or a hole. We'll have it overlap just the part that we want to cut off. And we'll select only our hole and our eyeball shape. Make sure we're not grouping it together with our head, and hit group. So now we have our eyeball shape with a flat side. We're going to look at this from the side here, and we're going to raise this up and then move it over into position. All right, like it needs to go up a little bit higher. There we go. So now we have an eyeball shape that's sticking way out of the head. So let's go ahead and squash this down flat so it looks more like it's part of the face. And if we look at it from this side, you can see we've got our eye shape that kind of bulges out the side. So let's focus on this using our little brackets button here, Fit to View, or F on the keyboard. And I can easily get this rotate tool and turn it just one step over to the side. So now our flattened sphere eyeball looks like it's sticking appropriately out of his face. Great. Now I can take this one and duplicate it over to make the other one. We're going to click on Duplicate and Repeat, and go over to the other side and click on Mirror, and then down here and click on our left-right mirror. Since I had it tilted one direction, my mirrored version will be tilted the other direction. Now I can just use the arrow keys to move it over until it sticks out on the other side of his face. I'm sliding my camera back and forth with the middle mouse button and rotating it around with the right mouse button. All right, his eyes look good. Now we just need to design his mouth. I'm going to use the same trick that I used to make the mouth on our flat design. We're going to grab a cylinder here, and I'm going to, let's turn it into a hole for right now, and then increase the number of sides. And let's figure out how big we need our cylinder so that it will cut a shape that will look like the smile that we want. I'm going to look at this straight up from the top here, and I'm going to click on our switch to flat view. That way I can see exactly how much of the face this hole is going to cut out. So there we go. I'm only concerned with the bottom line of this, because I want our smile shape here to look right. Now that I think this is good, I'm going to move it over to the side here because I want to work on some things without messing up my head. So let's move over and turn this back into a solid. Now we will make a duplicate of our cylinder. We'll move it up a bit and turn it into a hole. Let's stretch this guy out in both directions at once by holding down Alt on the keyboard, and then I can stretch this out. So now I am seeing a smile looking shape left over. So that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. Click on our shape here, make another duplicate. I'm going to move it over to the side. I just want this duplicate of my cylinder so I don't have to make a brand new cylinder. That way I can add what I need once I group these two. So we're going to group the first cylinder and a hole right up here. So now we have that smiling face shape. We want to get that little up, down, up wave in the top that gives him his little beak. So I'm going to take my spare cylinder here and squash it down until I can use it to fill in that shape. I think I'm also going to have to rotate it just a little bit. So when I click on the rotate handle, I'm going to keep it outside the circle. until I have it rotated at the angle that I think I want. Maybe we'll move it down a little bit more and stretch it out. Now, let's try duplicating this shape and using the mirror tool and the left-right arrow. I'm going to use the right arrow key on my keyboard to move it over. All right. So I want them to cross so I can get that little point here, but they don't want to line up exactly in the center. Since I'm moving 1 millimeter at a time, if something is an odd number, it's going to be half a millimeter off. What I can do is select my two shapes here by clicking on one, holding on Shift on the keyboard, clicking on the other one, and I'll group them together. Now that I have this shape as one object, I can hold down Shift, click on my smile here, and then we'll click on the Align tool and line them up in the center. So now my shape is exactly point in the center. This maybe comes up a little bit too much, so I think I'll select it and just squash it down a little bit. It's like 1 millimeter is too much for that. So I'll go ahead, click on the snap grid and turn it off. And I can just make it the tiniest bit shorter. There we go. I like that. So now we have the line that we want. We're going to go ahead and grab this and group it together and turn it into a hole. And before I forget, I'm going to turn my snap grid back on. So I'm going to click on this and go back to 1 millimeter. Snapping it to the grid makes it a little bit easier to line things up without having to use the Align tool all the time. Let's shrink this in a little bit, make sure it fits inside of the face. All right, now it's looking good. I'm going to rotate my view again to see that this hole would cut all the way through his head, so I don't want that. I'm going to click on my up and down arrow here, raise this up so that it's only going to cut out of the front of his head. Now let's go ahead and drag a box around all of this and group it together. And I'll click on the color here and turn on multicolor just so I can see his eyes better. All right. Now he looks like his mouth is mostly done, but I think we want a shape in there just for his tongue. I'm going to go ahead and grab a new sphere. Since I've already cut pieces out of all of these, I will increase the size, steps I mean, and then I'll change it to a pinkish color. Let's go ahead and squash this tongue. Don't really want it sticking out of his mouth. That's a little bit too much. So let's keep shrinking it down with our handles until we get it to be the right distance. So it's not sticking out of his mouth anywhere. I'll hold down Alt and use my side handle there. I'll go ahead. There we go. All right. He's looking happy. Now we could add another shape for the pupils of his eyes, but I think we'll just paint them on at the end. I think his head is ready to go. So now we can go ahead and group that together again. We had to do two different groups here because we wanted the hole to cut through his head, but not cut the same hole out of his tongue shape. All right, now it's time to get started on his body. Let's move his head off to the side a bit. And we're going to grab a new sphere. And let's change this to a color that looks like his body. And increase the number of steps. We'll hold down Shift and grab one of our size handles and just scale it up a bit. We want the size of this to look like it matches his head. We can change the entire size of this figure once we decide how big we want to print him, but we want our proportions to be correct. So let's move his head up and let's rotate it from the side here. We'll point it out at 345 degrees, make him really looking up. And then we can move it over to where it would attach to his body. And let's see. Looks like his body is a little bit big. I think in our drawings, his body is only slightly larger than his head. Go ahead and shrink this down a bit. We can move our head down so it looks like it is connected. And I think that's looking good. All right. With our head in place, we're going to add the details that this body needs. We're going to make a shell slightly thicker than this and an edge for that shell. I'm going to go ahead and click on our body shape. We're going to duplicate this. And we're going to hold down Shift and Alt and make the duplicate just a millimeter bigger all the way around. So while it doesn't look much different, I'm going to give this a different color. So I know this is the other part of his body. I'm going to grab a box here, and we're going to use it to cut off the part that isn't the shell. Let's go ahead and drag the handles of this box so that it's big enough to cut through our whole sphere here. And then we'll use our rotate handle to just tilt it down. Maybe not quite that much. Let's change the angle a little bit. And see how much of this we want to remove. All right. Make sure that the only part outside of the box is the part we want to keep. And we'll hold down Shift, select our shell, and group it. There we go. But now his shell has a flat, hard edge on it. So let's go down our list of basic shapes and find a torus. So now we know how big our sphere is at 29 right now. So I can go ahead and click on this and change the radius to half of 29. So that's going to be 15.5. Let's make this the right color for what we want. And while we're here, let's increase the number of sides so it looks a little smoother. Then we just have to look at it from the side and go ahead and rotate it. Oops. There we go. Rotate it until it lines up with our shell. That's looking good. Now, of course, it's all in the wrong place, so I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and select our body. And then we'll click on the Align tool. And before I click on any of these handles, I want to click on the body again, and it makes all of the align handles line up with the body instead of the other shape. So now I can center it, and it will move only our little shell detail and not the body at all. There we go. Now it's orbiting around the body, and all we have to do is click on it and use the arrow keys to move it a few millimeters back. And there we go. Now it looks a little bit thick, so we can change the width of this tube by changing the value here. I can make it extremely solid or much, much smaller. So we'll go ahead and click on this and change it to 1. Let's see how good that is. Ooh, that's very thin. Let's try 1.5. All right, now it's looking good. And we're ready to start making some limbs. Since I have a solid sphere here in the body, I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate that, move it over to the side, and let's start building ourselves some arms and legs. So let's change the color. So we know this is his arm. And we're going to squash all of the handles in until we have a long round arm shape. A little bit too long for him, so we'll squash it down. And he's going to need some fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. And since I copied this with duplicate and repeat, it's going to repeat the same thing I did, which is going to move it over to the side and shrink it down the same amount in each direction. This is okay for now, but I don't want to keep on shrinking it down, or I'll just keep on making tinier and tinier circles. So let's go ahead and delete those. I'll take this guy, shorten him, well, let's hold down Shift and make him a little bit smaller, and raise it up so we can make this one of our fingers. Now let's click on the arm and fit it to screen so I can see. And I think we want our arm to be a little bit narrower in that direction. That looks good. All right, so I've got finger number 1 here. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it, move it over, and duplicate it again. So now we have our 3 fingers, and I think I want to move them around a bit so they don't all point straight forward. Let's rotate them out. And rotate this one out this way. And now move the thumb down a bit, over. There we go. Looks like we have all 3 of its fingers. I might rotate this one back. Oop. Keep in mind the rotate tool can sometimes be difficult. All right, so now I've got my hand pose here, and I think the fingers are maybe a little too long. Looks a little cuter with shorter, fatter fingers. So shorten them all. And we're going to group everything together. So we have one group that makes up the arm. Let's zoom out here. And let's go ahead and place our arm in position. We're going to need to use rotate again. And I like to if they look good, snap them to one of these markers because it's easier to go back if we know exactly how far we've gone in the first place. Now I can nudge this around with my arrow keys until it looks like it's in the right place. And I can even go up and down with the arrow keys. If I hold down Control, I can raise and lower my shape. So now we have the arm coming out the side of the shell right next to his head. I want to make a second arm on the other side doing the same thing. So we're going to duplicate this entire guy and use our mirror tool again. Duplicate, mirror, and left and right. And we'll scoot this arm over to the other side. There we go. Now the legs are going to be constructed out of pretty much the same objects. So I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate of this and use it to start my leg. That way I don't have to create this all over again. I just have to move around his fingers to create his toes. So first, I'm going to grab everything and raise it up so he's not sitting on the ground, so he's going to be tall enough that I know where his legs should be. So let's grab this all by clicking and dragging a box around it. And we'll raise him up off the ground. And right now, we're just making a guess at how long we want his legs to be. That looks okay for now. I'm going to put his legs down there and see what we get. So let's click on an arm again, duplicate it, and we will move it down. We can easily hit D for drop to move it right down to the floor. And I'll use the mirror tool and mirror in the up and down direction. So now we get an idea of what that might look like as a leg. And I think it might be not quite thick enough to be his leg, and maybe a little bit too long. So let's go ahead and select everything, move it down a little bit. That seems good. I'm going to take our shape here, and we're going to be moving our toes around so it looks like a foot. We're not going to be worried about things that go down below the work plane. So we are going to use the work plane as our floor. We're going to cut everything off that goes below the floor so that he has a nice flat surface on his feet that allows you to print him easily. Go ahead and rotate our leg a little bit. There we go. And I think we'll hold down Shift and raise it up a little just to make this thing thicker. So his legs are a little sturdier than his arms. And I think I'll rotate it from above here so that his leg will face forward. And I can use my arrow keys to move it into position. All right. We're going to put his tail on the ground at the end, so he'll be a nice tripod and he'll stand up, won't fall over. Now let's go ahead and ungroup our new arm leg and turn these fingers into toes. I'm going to go ahead and delete the ones that are not in a good spot. And I'll use the one that's almost right to make my new toes. Rotate this up a little bit. Oop. And now I can duplicate this toe and use the arrow keys to move it out where I want it, and then duplicate it again. Let's go the other direction with that one. Now let's zoom in a bit so we can see these toes better. So we're not worried about the part that goes underneath the floor. We only want the part that's above that to look good. So I'm going to look at it from above here, and we'll rotate these out to the side a bit. There we go. I think that's looking good. Now we can go ahead and make a second leg. So I'll select the leg and the toes, and we'll group them together. Then we'll duplicate this, mirror once again, mirror it left and right, and we'll move it over here. So now we have a perfectly symmetrical version of this guy, but we could also try and make him with his one leg up. If we want him to have a knee joint, we're going to need another piece in there. So let's go ahead and ungroup this. And I'll take this leg and let's try rotating it out. Oops. To rotate it in two different directions. There we go. And we'll move it over so that it looks like it's connected to his toes. And I think we can shrink it a little bit. Maybe his knee is a little bit too high up there. Drag this down so we don't have to worry about the part that goes under the ground. And then we'll duplicate this shape. And then rotate it again. So let's go ahead and rotate it in both directions so that it goes the opposite of the part of the leg we have already. And then raise it up so these two parts intersect. Looks like I maybe want to rotate it a little bit more. All right. Now my knees don't want to line up, so I'm going to turn off the snap grid again. And let's move this around so it looks much better. I'll shrink this part of the leg too. And maybe shrink this one down a little bit also. There we go. So now I've fiddled around with the knee until it looks lined up. Go ahead and I'll make this one a little bit wider. There we go. Okay. Enough fiddling with that leg. Now, his leg looks okay. It looks very weird since it goes underneath the floor. But I think we're good. So it's time to create this tail. Now, making the swirl on the end of the tail is the most difficult part of Squirtle. So I've found that the best shape for that is going to be in our shape generators. Click on all here. We're going to have to go all the way over to, let's skip ahead to page 15, I think. Oop. 15. Nope, 16. There it is, 16. So we're going to take this strange shape called the corneum, which is a more kind of curvy, fat, three-dimensional spiral. We could also try to use the helix, but I like this one better. And you can see that I've put a star on these. If you find any shape that you like to use, you can click on the star up in the corner, and it will add it to your favorites. And if we go to click on our shape tools here, we go down to U at the bottom, favorites will show you all the things that you put a star on, so you can find them again much easier. I'll go back to basic shapes for this. Let's go ahead and with this shape selected, I'm going to add a sphere into it. And let's hold down Shift and shrink it down a bit, so we can fill up that middle space. There we go. Just want to fill up that middle space there, so we have that swirl around. And because this shape turns into a spiral in both directions, I have to go in here and decrease the separation so that it stays flat. And then we'll go ahead and select both of our objects and align, and we'll align them up and down in the center. So now we have that curl around to a little ball at the end of it. We'll turn both of these into our correct color. Now that looks a little better joined together. Then we just need the rest of the tail that comes off of here and connects to our body. So let's go ahead and stop aligning. And I'm going to go down to my half a sphere. I'll change the color so it matches. And we'll look at it from the side and rotate our half a sphere over 90 degrees. I'm using half a sphere here because I don't want the rest of it sticking out the other side of the tail. So we're just going to change the size of this so that it matches up. Oh, I realize that I've got snap grid off still. Let's put that back to 1 millimeter so that I can snap things together. All right, looks like I'll have to type in some numbers to get it to be nice round numbers again. 10 by 10, and this little guy is not a nice round number either. We'll go ahead and change him to be 22. There we go. Now we can line up the edges of things. I'm going to go ahead and shrink this down. Oops, undo that. Hold down Alt, shrink it down in both directions. And we'll click on our cornium shape and select our half a sphere at the same time. Use the Align tool to line them up in the center, up and down again. Now that we have our half circle here, half sphere, can stretch it out, and it looks like our tail joins up. So the edges here don't match perfectly well. I'm going to click on our cornium shape and look. You can see that this design, part of some of these shapes have a cross section like this. I can change it so that it is more of a circle. That way it will match the circular shape of our half sphere here. So now that's looking a little bit good. I'm going to increase the radius here. Oops, just a bit. Oh, there we go. Cross-section diameter. That's what I wanted to increase. There we go. Now we're getting close to the same shape. So these will match up a little bit better. And once again, I should turn off my snapping so that I can match them up really well. And I may just stretch this out. That way the tail, we'll add another one. That way the tail will look a little bit fuller. So let's duplicate this. And I'll increase my duplicate out here. Rotate it a little. And we'll hold down Shift or Alt. There we go. And shrink it down so it matches with the top part of the tail. Alright, now that I've designed my complicated tail shape, I'm going to click and drag a box around it, group it together. I'm going to take my tail and stand it up on its side. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. Then we're going to look at, zoom out here and look at it compared to our Squirtle. We're going to rotate it all the way around, oops, 180 degrees, so it sticks out the back. We're going to raise it up so it just goes under the floor a little bit. And so that it sticks into the body of Squirtle. Looks like I think we have to rotate it this way a little. That's looking good. And instead of shooting straight out the back, let's turn it to the side so that we can see it when we look at him from the front. All right. Now I think, like my previous design, that I should actually make this tail a little bigger. Let's go ahead and hold down Shift and scale it up and then rotate it. Whoops, didn't mean to click on the head. There we go, rotate it to the side. And now it's coming from the middle of him and going out to one side. And we just have to tilt it up a little bit. All right. Once we've got that tail looking like it's in the right place, our last move is going to be to cut the bottom off of everything so that he will be perfectly flat when he gets printed. Let's go up and click on the box here. We're going to drag the corner of this box out until it's bigger than our entire figure, and then drag the top handle down past the floor underneath it. So now the top of the box lines up exactly with the floor. We can go ahead and select everything at once and group them together. I'll let Tinkercad think about this for a while. And there we go. Now his feet and tail have flat spots on the bottom so that when he's printed, he will easily stand perfectly upright. We are going to prepare our standing Squirtle model for print. Select our design, make sure that it is all grouped as one object, and hit export. I'm going to export only the selected shape as an STL file. Then we're going to head over to Cura. So I've got my printer and my type of plastic selected in Cura. And we're going to go ahead and open our downloads here. Let's zoom in and take a look at our shape, making sure that our flat spaces that we intended to be on the ground are on the ground. So we've got these blue highlights there. We can see that we have a lot of red downward facing elements that are going to need some support. And since he has a lot of very smooth curved surfaces, we're going to want to print this guy at a very high resolution. So if we take a look at the quality settings, the higher quality equals a smaller layer height, which means as it goes up slower, each layer line becomes thinner and thinner, and it makes it much smoother looking. This also means that you can go a little bit out further with each layer without supports. Because of the height of each layer, we stack them on top of each other, just slightly overlapping until it comes out the distance you want. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we put it on our highest quality setting. So the amount that the printer guesses that you'll need to support goes up as you increase the quality. And so the amount of red areas goes down. If we increase this to 60 degrees, you can see that it would suddenly change the amount of area that needs supports. Even just at the 59 that it does for super quality, you can see there's a lot less red. If I go down to standard quality, we'll be at 45. Let's change that so that it will update. There we go. And most of this area is going to need supports. So let's go ahead and try it at our super high quality, see how amazingly long it's going to take. We want to generate supports, and we can stick with touching the build plate because that way it's not going to build supports on top of our other areas. And since we have such a small area that needs supports, this might work out. So I'll hit slice. And we're going to see that this guy, although he's pretty small at a height of 42 millimeters, he is going to take 3 hours and 30 minutes. Since we're at this 0.12 millimeter super quality level, we can see that he's going to require 351 layers. And with the supports just holding up the top of his mouth, he really does look like he's kind of pouring water out of his face there. You can see that these layers are so thin, it's going to take quite a few to build him up. We'll have supports in the space underneath his body until it gets attached to his legs. And this one tower of support that holds up the upper part of his mouth. Hopefully he will print out super smooth with so many round surfaces and so thin layers. Now that we like how he's going, we're going to save to file, and we've got our G-code ready to print.